So, you know, on the top of that structure is the Supreme Court. We'll get into it a little bit more, but that, you know, give you a nice rhyme, is the court of last resort. It's the final arbiter. There's nowhere else to go after this, really. We'll begin to talk a little bit more about its structure, but just for the purposes of here, we've got 9 justices. You know, we talked about, for example, in the district courts, you can have a 3-judge panel, and there's multiple judges within the district courts that can often sit together. Here, you know, again, so what's interesting is on the trial courts, you have like 1 judge. And as you go up, you get more judges because that ideally makes a more sound decision. So district courts having 3-judge panels, Supreme Court having a 9. The number is just because Congress picked it as 9. It's fluctuated anywhere from 6 to 10, right? So they're the ones that will make the final determination. We'll begin to kind of talk about, you know, the upheaval that the court, you know, has experienced over the last couple of years with the death of, who was this? Scalia, right? And we'll talk about Merrick Garland. You know, I got his name at the top of my head today. And then Gorsuch, and how that's affected the kind of the character and nature of the court. There's some interesting things to kind of dig into because, you know, what's the significance of that number? Well, it's, on many levels, you can put them on a spectrum. And this was the spectrum while Scalia was there. And I would say when you put Gorsuch in, he is solidly kind of conservative. What's interesting is, you know, essentially there is this block of conservative voters, this block of more liberal voters, and it puts in particular Kennedy as a kind of a kingmaker. Because he's often the swing justice. So even though this is, who's the Supreme Court Chief Justice?
No, wait.
He's up here.
He's
the guy right in the middle.
John Roberts, right? So John Roberts is the Chief Justice. But in many ways, Kennedy may be as impactful, if not more impactful, because he's kind of the decision maker. And I was just reading an article yesterday, I should find it for you guys, but it talks about how their kind of workload has stalled a little bit because of this new kind of balance, and the complexity of what they're looking at has made it kind of hard for them to reach decisions. The divide is a little more pronounced than it's been in the past as Gorsuch joined the court.
Do you think it kind of says anything that all the women are liberal? It's not just kind of like coincidence.
Well, it isn't coincidence in that who appointed them. So that's what you want to look at. Sandra Day O'Connor was actually a Reagan appointment, and she was conservative, but she in many ways was a Kennedy. She was the swing justice. She was the one that did Casey versus Planned Parenthood, that rolled back Roe v. Wade a little bit, but still kept the right to an abortion. She was the one that said that the standard means any regulation should not have an undue burden, place an undue burden on the mother. So, you know, she is a female that could be seen as conservative, but lean a little bit, and the swing justice. So it's an interesting sociological study. We're going to look into their backgrounds as well. What you're going to find is there's some diversity here, but maybe not as much as you think in terms of education and other things. Let me get in play mode.
I told Corbett that today. I told him yesterday.
So one of the things I want to spotlight before I move on to types of cases too is, like, again, the swing justices have more impact. Sometimes a key personality like a Hugo Black or a Brennan has more impact than, not a Colby Brennan, but has more impact than you think. But look at the tools of the Chief Justice and picture a question about presiding officers, because you could plug this in for any question about presiding officers, right? That power to preside, I either recognized your hand in your comment or I didn't, right? I either took your question or I didn't, right? Power to preside is the power to kind of control conversation and debate. They assign the writings of opinions. So if I give Roe v. Wade to a Harry Blackman, I'm going to get a right to privacy read in for kind of more medical reasons than constitutional reasons, right? I might assign a writing and get a killer phrase with all deliberate speed that gets you to sign on to it, but kills the actual impact of the verdict in Brown v. Board. So assigning the opinion writing is pretty impactful in terms of the how it affects the outcome of the case and the implementation of the verdict, right? Other powers, they get to administer the oath of office to the president and vice president. I should add, they preside over impeachment proceedings in the Senate. Other little things, but these are, you know, the more significant kind of factors. And again, we'll get into it later, but if I'm just still looking at the structure of the courts, keep in mind that yes, they are the final arbiters of cases, but look at all the combinations of cases they might look at, and how important is that? You know, to have someone to finally reconcile what the Constitution means, and what the Constitution means with regards to national law or state law, or controversies between states, controversies between citizens and states, controversies between citizens and the national government. I come up for air, really critical, right? So there is just the basic structure that we kind of looked at. We looked at each level, and we looked at kind of what are the defining characteristics of each level. But I'm gonna work two types of cases up through here, right? There's my little comedic sorbet to give you guys kind of a break, right? Two types of cases, criminal or civil. Can we distinguish them in general? You know, what makes a criminal case, and what makes a civil case a civil case? Colin, what do you think?
A civil case is like, it involves money being exchanged
Good.
between people.
Okay, so the kind of the penalties,
Yeah.
the stakes are a little different. Criminal might involve more of a compensation of some sort, a financial penalty to remedy a wrong, whereas criminal,
I feel like criminal is that something you broke the law, like
Good.
laws placed down by the government, while civil, you've infringed on somebody else's rights.
Perfect.
It's not
Yep.
necessarily about the law.
So good. So you added something, and we'll kind of bring in what Colin said as well. So the kind of the nature of the infraction is different, right? In a criminal case, you are violating kind of a governmental law, whatever level of government we want to kind of imagine. Stay with me, guys. You're violating a governmental law, and that kind of poses a larger threat to society, right? That if we don't uphold our laws, then does that threaten civil society? And with a civil case, it is often a dispute between different parties, two different parties, and if you follow it down the rabbit hole, maybe it threatens society at large, but not immediately. So just to give you a quick example, what about like medical malpractice, right? If doctors are like leaving surgical implements in patients left and right, ooh, that's a kind of a threat to society, but it's down the road. A single instance of that is you want to remedy that wrong, and you want to discourage careless practices by doctors. You know, there's accident and there's careless kind of practices, but it's not a threat to society at large, right? And that's a great way to come back to what Colin was saying. The penalties would be different. With criminal, because you're threatening society at large, what do they take away potentially?
Fundamental rights.
Your most fundamental rights, right? Which could be one of two things. Liberty or life, right? Civil is a financial kind of compensation. It is a restitution. You were fired wrongly, and we're going to reinstate you into your job. I printed something wrong about you, and we're going to issue a retraction, right? What's the burden of proof? Because that's the third difference. You know?
Criminal, you probably, especially like the higher, like especially with the higher punishment.
Higher punishment means higher bar of evidence,
You need
right?
a lot of evidence. versus
What's
some
what's the language? I need to prove you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Thank you, Dave. Sorry.
Does anybody know what it is in civil cases?
Within a reasonable doubt?
Well, kind of. It's a preponderance of evidence. All right, so what does preponderance mean? I got a scale.
Like, it's understandable.
Yeah, there's more evidence to suggest you did than you didn't.
Yeah.
You know, a preponderance of evidence means this pile is bigger than this pile. And we've tipped the scales. It's reasonable to expect that you did it.
So majority of the evidence is against you?
There's a preponderance, the majority of the evidence is against you, yeah. So again, these kind of summarize it, that this is a crime against society. Here are some examples. And you can kind of see that, oh yeah, robbery, rape, embezzlement, murder, that's a threat to civil society. And because there is a higher penalty, there is a higher standard. What's interesting is we kind of qualify the criminal cases as well, just to make it even more complicated, right? There's levels, there's offenses, and you might, I don't know, get a ticket, you might get, some sort of, written warning, that kind of classifies you as somebody on a probation or a warning. It could be a misdemeanor, it could be a felony. And what I'm always fascinated with is like what separates a misdemeanor from a felony when you get into that gray area, right? So let's say stealing, right? How do I go from petty larceny to grand larceny? There's literally a dollar amount where you cross the divide.
Isn't it like
20,000? The amount I'd have to look up and just keep the phones in the pockets. The amount I'd have to look up, but it literally is a dollar amount that shifts it. What makes it go from, let's say, reckless endangerment to manslaughter, homicide?
Damage caused and also your intent.
Damage caused in your intent. Did I use my fist? Did I use a bat? Was it a crime of kind of passion and I just kind of got swept up, or was it calculated?
Like, when it comes to like stealing, it could also be like how important or dangerous thing you steal is. Like if I steal,
Oh, yeah.
if I steal a bunch of Kit Kat bars, that's much different from me stealing, say, life-saving drugs
Right.
from a pharmacy.
Right. So there's a lot of things that kind of classify it as this. Now, the other thing I want you guys to jump out, and we already mentioned this, and you're gonna see this in some charts in a little bit, is with criminal cases, again, typically what happens in the hallways? Plea bargains, right? 90% of these cases don't make the trial level. Look at it this way. Wow. So really, one of the things I'm struck by is that this is the percentage of cases that are resolved by plea bargaining, and these are the percentage that go to trial, and then what percentages result in convictions. And often if you're going up against a state attorney or a district attorney, they don't tend to take cases to trial unless they have a pretty strong case. So what's the leverage here? Well, the leverage is in many ways minimum mandatory sentencing guidelines, where they can simply say, look, you take this to trial and you lose, you are going to get 30 years for this. That's the minimum mandatory sentencing guideline. We'll cop right now to 15 and out in 10 with good behavior or something like that. So on some level, if our judicial system is based on brokering, because that's more efficient to kind of get through the court's docket, that says something. That says that either that we're a really kind of, a society that necessitates a lot of criminal and civil cases, we're just overly reliant on it, or we don't value the right to a trial and provide the courts with the resources and the money that they need. But either way, there's something a little off when you look at those numbers.
Sure, this doesn't always work, right? You can't just like, plead guilty to a murder and hope to get less.
Sure.
You can do that? Yeah.
Well, you might take the death penalty off the table,
Oh, fair enough.
right? You might, there may be a way that they kind of, it's second-degree murder instead of first-degree.
Why not get you a life sentence?
Yeah, so there is different ways of kind of, again, plea bargaining even the most heinous of crimes. But it depends. Sometimes the state, would want to make like we don't plea bargain for that type.
Like make an example.
Yeah, let's say it was a hate crime, a terrorist kind of crime, a police officer was shot, that kind of thing. Right. So, okay, civil, just to kind of flip it, right? These are, as Paul had said, private disputes among individuals. There's not a larger threat to society. You've got malpractice, libel, breach of contract, personal injury. We need a preponderance of evidence because of the lesser kind of penalties, right? Compensation, returning the thing of value, as I mentioned, right? A great illustration, and I've already done it, OJ, because it seemed like they went after him twice for the death of his wife, the murder of his wife, Nicole Brown Smith, and a guy named Ron Goldman, who was, they had been separated, I believe, and I think he was the boyfriend. It's been so long. At any rate, he's tried in the civil court, the criminal court, and there's just really a lot of bungling of the prosecution. So again, when he is acquitted, when he is found not guilty, it really kind of shows you the racial divide in the country, that for a lot of people, and again, you saw this through the prism of race, a lot of people who are African Americans saw this as a vindication, that finally the system, they had made missteps, and normally it wouldn't matter, a person would get convicted one way or another, and finally the system, not that it worked, but that it didn't conspire, that mishandling of evidence finally was held against the court. For a lot of whites, they thought, holy cow, I can't believe that this guilty person went innocent, right, went free. But they come back after him in the civil court. And you can see that the burden of proof was easier, and the penalty is different. And he's still leading this kind of Shakespearean tragedy of a life. Go ahead.
Because the jury came to a conclusion really quickly. It was like a 180-day trial.
Mm-hmm.
It was like 11,000 pages of transcript.
Right.
Over almost over 150 pieces of evidence.
Right.
And yet they made the decision in like 3 hours.
Yeah. So kind of new, obviously, going in.
Right.
But that once again shows you that idea of reasonable doubt. Now, reasonable means not that there is a plausible explanation for other things where, you know, aliens came and murdered Nicole Brown Smith. Is that reasonable doubt? No, that's not reasonable. But there's enough, kind of like I said, mishandling of things in terms of the evidence. The
Some
gloves
say the
didn't
son
fit. What's that?
Some people say his son did it instead. Like
That's a way to introduce reasonable doubt. But again, underline that word reasonable.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to shift gears, and we're going to begin to kind of talk about the appointment process. This could be a standalone kind of question, right? What are the criteria used by the president and the Senate to appoint and confirm, right? And almost like a two-part question where you look at what the president might think of and what the Senate might think of, right? So I think I've got like 8 different kind of things to think about here, and hopefully, well, let's click away from it for a second. What do you think, what do you hope is the first and foremost thing someone would consider before appointing someone to be a member of the Supreme Court for any job? What would they look at? Kerrigan, what do you think?
Like, who's best in the field?
Who's best, right? Merit. And merit can be measured a lot of ways, right? Ideally, when we're thinking about merit, we're thinking about their judicial experience, that, you know, you're going to be on the court. Do you have any legal background? Have you served as a lawyer, as a judge? But keep in mind, I'm going to show you some diversity in the court, and there are people that come from other backgrounds, right? I may also want to look at your judicial kind of philosophy to make sure that I think you're going to make these sound judicial decisions. Really, when you look at the Constitution, this is another example how we're based on norms, not rules, right? There is nothing to say that here are the qualifications that you ought to look at. There is no age, residence, citizenship, even in a minimum. It could be almost anything. And our norms are to, again, look at people that have solid judicial backgrounds, but there's no reason someone can't deviate from that, right? Background is a huge concern. Now, background is a huge concern because this can come back to bite you. It can make you look like you are not capable as the president nominating somebody or doing your due diligence as the Senate, because they will look for skeletons in the closet. And if you pick someone that later on, okay, so Justice Black, for example, what's it turn out was in his background? What's in his closet? Yeah, it turns out he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Denounces it, steps away from it, doesn't scuttle his nomination. Turns out that's not a deal breaker, right? But that was obviously kind of damning for the Roosevelt administration. They could probably withstand anything because World War II and the Great Depression, right? We'll give them a pass, I suppose, on that one, was the attitude. I'll give you a more recent example, and that is Clarence Thomas. He was on the continuum. Do you recognize the name, and do I need to click back?
Oh, he was the African American.
Yep, Strom Thurmond being, not Strom Thurmond, he's the opposite of Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall being the first African American kind of appointee, and then Clarence Thomas, again, you'll see it as a criteria. Diversity matters, because that's a way to kind of grow political capital and signal to a demographic that you support them and their interests. So he was significant in that he was African American and conservative, but what came out is a sexual harassment charge against him by a former clerk, someone who worked with him. Her name was Anita Hill. And as the tape is rolling, I'm going to be really delicate about it, but he reportedly asked her out repeatedly, and she turned him down, and then he turned the conversation to uncomfortable things, including his favorite films. Down there somewhere, right? And what is really wild is occasionally you see things in politics you'd never expect. Hearings that kind of delve into his, where he's being questioned by the Senate on his Blockbuster kind of membership, and you know, what kind of is in his queue. And it's, you know, wow, that's an interesting report to read, okay? Do you think that really damaged the president to have that as the scene in the nomination battle, right? So again, you want to consider background. Before you pick anybody, you make sure that they are squeaky clean, right? What else do we look at? Well, party, that one's pretty obvious. You try to use that as a barometer for how they'll vote. So typically you pick them from your own party, but again, you see how the videos are really important? Eisenhower appoints Warren, you remember? And Warren was because I owed a favor, in a sense. He helped me carry the elections, right? So Eisenhower appoints Warren, and he's also going to appoint Brennan. And they both, by party ID and previous kind of rulings, seem to be conservative. And then they go super liberal. And I love the line that Eisenhower publicly identifies Warren as one of the two biggest mistakes he ever made, and Brennan is the second, right? It's a great line. I don't know if Eisenhower meant it to be as pithy and as witty as it was. Maybe people liked him, so maybe he was, you know, for that sense of humor. I like Ike.
I still like Ike.
But sometimes you use party as a barometer. But look down, you know, if you look at these guys, it's not a great indication. And what's interesting is how, because of like Eisenhower and others being stung by who they picked, they start more going into the appellate level, those district courts. And so typically those are safe picks. They have a body of judicial work, and I can kind of look at them, and this guy consistently rules conservative. But that robs the court of some of its diversity. Like you were mentioning, hey, there's 3 women and they all seem liberal. But what was interesting is the women were appointed as a way to diversify the courts. Sometimes we look at religion, sometimes we look at ethnicity. Sonia Sotomayor was a pick that, you know, Hispanic and a woman, and 2 constituencies really happy with that. And if we could have if she was just left-handed, you know, with redhead, you know, we would have hit some other demographics, right? You're gonna see it's kind of odd to think of 9 people and try to get all your demographics in there with 9 and keep everyone happy. But look what Roosevelt did. He's got a law professor, he's got senators. I mean, they have legal background, but a different kind. A chair from the Securities and Exchange Commission that monitors, you know, the trading of stocks and things like that. That's an interesting position to have. And then he's got attorneys, and I'll talk about a solicitor general. That in many ways is the 10th justice. I talk about him for one day, and it was a question one year. They're the ones that argue the governmental side of the argument in front of the courts.
Yeah, so I know like there's obviously a broad range of people that they can choose from, but
Right.
is there like, are there kind of more people that they have in like their inner circle, or like people that they know better that they'll choose, or are they just like random people that they've seen?
Not necessarily random, so they at any point kind of know the, I wonder where it comes up. They literally have kind of these aggregate tables that kind of like look at health, well-being.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
And so they kind of like, your favorite, the notorious RBG, right? She does push-ups every day and she's staying healthy, and I think she's gonna, you know, she wants to serve as long as she possibly can, but they probably already have a list of who they might appoint. So they do definitely have that
Yeah, I know
kind
his
of,
method.
yeah.
I don't know if this is like something you're gonna get to eventually, but how does like the Chief Justice appointment work? Like,
So,
do
yeah.
they fill that? Like, is it like they, whenever the.
It can be
one
either.
leaves, they fill
It can be either.
Okay.
So, if, for example, one of the things you'll see in an upcoming video is Rehnquist will become a Chief Justice. He comes in as an appointed, like he's gonna come in as they're called Associate Justices, and then there's a surprise vacancy. So they appoint him to become the Chief Justice. Alternatively, they can just kind of promote somebody within the, and actually I'm saying it wrong, that's how he got it. So you could appoint someone in to become not only justice, but an associate justice, but a chief justice, or you can promote somebody from within.
Yeah.
But either way, it's the president that does that, and the Senate that would confirm. And you'll see that in video number 4. It'll answer exactly that question. All right, I mentioned demographics, race, geography, religion, gender. But it's kind of complicated to get, like, you know, all your demographics covered that satisfy constituencies when you have 9 figures and maybe you're only lucky enough to have 1 appointment, right? So what's interesting is, can I just announce, like you were asking, do I have a pool of candidates? Sure do. And I might mention several names for you to say, oh, very good, you've got someone who is from the South. You've got someone who is, you're gonna see religion is something that they looked at for a while. It'd be interesting to kind of think of someone who's gay. I've got someone on my list. And just kind of like use that as a way to like throw a bone to a constituency, but not really kind of name them. Not really kind of seriously consider them. So, what's kind of interesting is you can look at gender and religion and the state they're born in and the law degree and see that, check it out to see if you think there's diversity or not. Pretty good gender balance at this point. What's interesting is the court with the recent nominees pivoted from like all Protestant to like no Protestant. We've got 3 Jewish justices, there's Catholic. It's kind of interesting to see how it pivoted. And man, are the Ivy Leagues represented,
I was just thinking that.
right? Certainly, where's my state schools, right? So, yeah. What else do we consider? Well, evaluation by interest groups, and in particular the American Bar Association. So that's a group of, that's an interest group for people within the legal profession, lawyers, who work with these judges, and they would give a rating system. They would literally kind of, we give this nomination a score of 100, 50, we don't like this person, right? And they did it by like canvassing their members, literally giving them surveys. What's interesting is over time, this has become, even though it's attorneys with a lot of money, they're seen as perhaps liberal in terms of their leanings, and like a Republican Senate or Republican president probably wouldn't rely on them too much. Now, just to kind of look at they liked Gorsuch, and to be honest with you, on paper, Gorsuch has all the right kind of experience. His background is pretty impeccable. His judicial philosophy is that of, he follows the law and feels like, if you follow the law, sometimes you're not gonna like your own rulings. That you've got to kind of have the standard that upholds. What they're finding in the court, though, is he's quick to assert himself. He's pretty confident. And again, that's explaining the divide and the struggle that they may be having. He's not particularly differential yet to the other members, and he'll insert his questions as quick as anybody else. Senate plays a role, and we've been over this, so I can go super fast, right? The Senate has the power of confirmation, and in general, remember, the threat of a check is probably as impactful, if not more impactful, than the use of it, because that's a zero-sum game. So, because the Senate is going to confirm, forces the president to typically pick what kind of person on the political spectrum. More of a moderate, right? Unless you have kind of, an even balance. Maybe I don't have to pick a moderate if I control both the House and the Senate and the White House. Moderate figures have been picked, but you also have this additional strategy of I don't like whoever you nominate. So what has the Senate been using increasingly to block judicial nominees, in particular the intermediate courts? The filibuster. And not even the filibuster, they simply announced their intention to filibuster. Because that's all it takes. If you are what proof? Cloture proof, right? And so we do see that as an increasing kind of trend. Now, when does it become bitterly partisan? Around Bork.
That guy. He looks like he'd be partisan.
All right, I have an article for you, but let me play this. A little cool jazz music to kick in then.
Now, we remember a man whose failed Supreme Court nomination provoked a lasting partisan divide over judicial nominations. Robert Bork died today at the age of 85. As Solicitor General in the Nixon administration, he played a small but crucial role in the Watergate crisis. But the former federal judge and legal theorist became a hero to conservatives, largely for what he did not do, get confirmed to the High Court. NPR Legal Affairs correspondent Nina Totenberg reports.
Bork, a ruddy-faced, bearded, and burly former Marine, made his first mark in academia as a specialist in antitrust. But by the 1960s, he was selling a new brand of legal conservatism, which he dubbed original intent, meaning that judges should go no further in interpreting the Constitution than the words and intent of 1787. By the time President Reagan appointed him to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1987, Bork had spent 5 years as a federal appeals court judge and had, in both his judicial and academic roles, amassed a long paper trail of controversial legal writings. He opposed the Supreme Court's one-man, one-vote decision on legislative apportionment. He wrote an article opposing the 1964 civil rights law that required hotels, restaurants, and other businesses to serve people of all races. He opposed a 1965 Supreme Court decision that made contraceptives available to married couples. There is no right to privacy in the Constitution, he said, and he opposed Supreme Court decisions on gender equality, too. That record prompted liberals and civil rights activists
Hold on, listen.
an all-out campaign to defeat him, including mass mailings, lobbying, and TV ads. Nonetheless, 2 months later, when the confirmation hearings began, public opinion was still on Bork's side. The hearings, however, would not work to his advantage. Known as a charming and witty man in private, Bork was dour and humorless in public, and his answers seemed to play into the stereotype liberals were painting of a man who cared little for the public. When Republican Alan Simpson pitched a softball to Bork asking him why he wanted to be a justice, here's how the nominee replied.
I think it would be an intellectual feast just to be there and to read the briefs and discuss things with counsel and discuss things with my colleagues.
TV critic Tom Shales would write of the testimony, he looked and talked like a man who would throw the book at you and maybe the whole country. In the end, Bork was defeated by a vote of 58 to 42, the largest margin in history. The whole episode, however, enraged many Republicans. Bork's name became a symbol of conservative grievance, and a new verb was born, to bork, defined in the dictionary as to defame or vilify a person systematically.
The nomination changed everything, maybe forever.
Tom Goldstein is publisher of the leading Supreme Court blog.
Republicans nominated this brilliant guy to move the law in a dramatically more conservative direction. Liberal groups turned around and blocked him precisely because of those views. Their fight legitimized scorched earth ideological wars over nominations at the Supreme Court. The upshot is that we have this ridiculous system now where nominees shut up and don't say anything that might signal what they really think.
The whole experience embittered Bork and hardened his conservative positions. He resigned his lower court judgeship and soon became a popular author, speaker, and culture warrior. In slouching towards Gomorrah, he inveighed against liberals, premarital sex, and working mothers. A decline runs across our entire culture, he wrote, and the rot is spreading. Nina Totenberg, NPR
Sounds like the
News.
most bitter, angry person.
So,
in existence.
now, keep in mind, you may disagree wholeheartedly with kind of like, he's not finding constitutional grounds for like gender equality and doesn't believe in the one man, one vote principle because he's got this 1800s version of the Constitution, not a 1900s version of the Constitution. But is there anything constitutionally that doesn't qualify him? We just don't like his ideology, right? So because you don't like his ideology and you find it kind of troubling how he might rule, he gets blocked. And that's, again, we're based on norms, not rules necessarily. That becomes the new norm. Anybody that is going to get nominated in many ways tries to basically have this low profile. This we'll talk about Robert Souter. He was known as the stealth candidate because you didn't have anything on him. So I'll get into that a little bit more. But the upshot is that politicized things. Filibusters began to be used, especially the cloture-proof ones, and we have this dragging out. Now, it doesn't always happen with the Supreme Court. It's more likely with the intermediate courts, the district courts. But you can see that the filibuster certainly is used with an increasing frequency, as is the effort to use cloture, and consequently you have massive vacancies, right? We'll pick up with the other criteria on the